All right, boys and girls. Today I'm going to show you how to start our social studies. We're going to be doing Chapter 1, Lesson 2. We're going to explore and contrast, and we're going to be focusing in the inquiry tool on page 18. You also have a computer document for this, and I'm going to show you that too. Explore, compare, and contrast. To compare is to find the similarities between two things. To contrast is to find their differences. Similarities and differences can be linked. Two cultures may have similarities because they both came from the same group or they have both lived in similar environments. A difference in culture, however, could mean that one group has an advantage or hardship that the other group does not. To compare and contrast, we're going to read the text all the way through. This will help you understand what the text is about. And then you're going to look for keywords related to the information you want. If you are looking for information about housing, look for words like house, home, and build, or materials like wood and stone. You're going to summarize the information, make quick, simple answers to your questions, and you're going to review your answers, ask yourself which are the same, which are different, and why. So I have created a document that's going to be showing you what to do. So we're going to use information to fill out this chart here. I'm going to do something a little different than what is in the book. What I'm going to use is I'm going to use the early desert people, and we're going to fill out a document that I gave you that looks very similar. It actually has 4 across, and I put an extra early desert people in there. So as we look, we're going to look for housing, culture, religion, and economy. And I'll just tell you right now that the culture and religion is not so specified in early desert people, but I will tell you some information that you will find in the Pueblo to give you an example. So let's take a look at the early desert people. And I'm sorry about the graininess of this. This is something you've already read, so just follow along in your head. The early American Indian groups of the Southwest developed in environments very different from the rainforests of Mexico and Central America. About AD 200, a group known as the Hokum moved from the parts of the Sonora Desert in northern Mexico to present-day Arizona, between the Salt River and the Gila River. At that time, the area received only about 3 inches of rain a year. Yet the settlers discovered ways to turn the desert into fields of corn, beans, squash, and cotton. I like to point out right here that corn, beans, squash, and cotton are all things that you would be able to write about in the economy section. Why would you say economy? Well, economy is how did they survive? How did they make their living? That's basically the economy. A lot of times when we think of economy, we think about money, but you got to think if I had this much fruit and you had this much corn, you might trade with each other. So that's basically an economy. All right. So when we go to the document, we'll find out where we're going to put that in a little while. The Hokum built, that's right, we have to read the whole thing first, right? The Hokum built a complex irrigation system to bring water to their fields. With simple tools such as sharpened sticks and stone blades, they dug shallow canals that stretched for hundreds of miles. Hokum farmers used small gates to direct water from these canals into their fields. The Hokum irrigation canals were built so well that some of them are still used today. Hokum farmers lived in small villages. They built their houses by digging a shallow pit and covering it with wooden frame roofs with plant material called thatch. Building underground helped to keep Hokum houses cool during the day and warm at night. The Hokum wove cotton into clothes for clothing. They made baskets and pottery for storage. Hokum jewelry was crafted from turquoise mined in the desert and from shells. Shell jewelry was especially prized. Hokum traders traveled long distance to trade cotton cloth and pottery for shells gathered by people on the coast on the Gulf of California and the Pacific coast. So that was about the Hokum, and now we're going to talk about another early American desert people, and in each section, they might come up with two different groups. So please be aware of that. So you might see two different groups mentioned in one. The ancestral Pueblos were another of the American Indian groups to settle in the desert of the Southwest. They are also known as the Anasazi. In about AD 700, the ancestral Pueblo people settled in the Four Corners area where Utah, Colorado, and Arizona and New Mexico meet today. Like the Hokum, the ancestral Pueblo planted squash, corn, and beans. The high desert plateaus where they lived were not suited to the use of canals for irrigation. However, instead the ancestral Pueblos developed a method called dry farming. They channeled rainwater and snowmelt into catch basins. Then this water was slowly released into narrow pebble-lined drains to the crops. The ancestrals are known as the first cliff dwellers. They lived in huge apartment-like dwellings built along the steep sides of the cliff. Living in the cliff dwellings, such as Mesa Verde, made it easier for the ancestral Pueblo to defend themselves against enemies. These dwellings were made of finely carved stone and logs that were plastered with adobe. Adobe is a mixture of mud and straw that dries into a hard clay. An adobe house stays cool during the heat of the day and warm during the cold desert night. Housing is the first thing we need to look for. So if we look at the Hokums, we see the word build. They built their houses by digging in shallow pits and covering it with wooden frames roofed with plant material called thatch. So I'm going to go to my document here, and in the housing section, I'm going to write down what they did, and I already have it ready. So ding, there it is. So the Hokum had wooden framed roofs with thatch. Now let's look at the ancestral people. Now the ancestral people were called the cliff dwellers. So they lived in huge apartment-like dwellings built along the steep sides of the cliffs. So on this, I am going to write the same thing. So the ancestral Pueblo, huge apartment-like dwellings built with adobe and along cliffs to protect against enemy. Now notice how they're not necessarily complete sentences, but it does tell you the information for that thing. Now the culture and religion of this group is not really mentioned. So there's not much there. So I filled that in, but I want you to know that when you get to the Pueblo people, you're going to find out that they have rituals and ceremonies held in kiosks, Kachini spirits, part of the Hokum culture. So I'm going to go ahead and fill this in for you to give you an example of what it looks like for culture and religion. In the Pueblo early desert people, it doesn't talk much about their beliefs, ceremonies, tracing of ancestry, or community. So I'm giving you that example in the Pueblo so that you have one already made. Now the economy. The economy talks about what they spent, how they did, what did they grow, those kind of things. So if we look back, we know that both of them did some farming. So they lived were not suited for canals for irrigation, instead they ancestral, so it says they squash, corn, and beans. We also have here corn, beans, squash, and cotton.
So that's part of their economy.
We also learned that they farmed crops such as corn, beans, squash, and cotton clothes, baskets, and pottery, turquoise jewelry, long distance trade for shells. We learned all about this in their economy. So again, this is just an example of what you're going to be doing. So next up for you will be about the Pueblo.
Where they lived, what kind of houses they lived in, their culture, their economy. And it's going to be up to you to fill out the document just like we did on the early desert people.
So there's three tribes that you're going to have to fill out this information. Please make sure that you ask me questions during your time with me, either on Zoom or in person, if you're not sure what to do for this. Today was just a listening and a following along. Tomorrow, we'll look at the Pueblo.